We're back on the record on media 2. The time is 1:30 p.m.
Okay. And I'm just going to give you this. All right. Is there any specific type of training that the department offers for their officers that request to be officers that work off duty as security?
I'm sorry, can you restate that question?
Sure. Is there any type of training, specific training that the department provides to officers that show a desire to work as an off-duty officer in a security setting?
Yes.
Okay. What type of training is that?
If officers want to work a club, they have to attend a training in order to be certified to work a club.
Okay. So there's a certification to work as a club security officer?
Certification, I'm not exactly sure if it goes to the word certification, but it is a training, and
Okay.
they're given what's called a club card, which allows them to work club jobs.
Okay. And what does it take to earn a club card to work security as a off-duty officer?
I'm not familiar with the certificate or the training for that.
Okay. And what about there's traffic also, right? There's special training for traffic officers?
Well, all cadets receive traffic training, and officers will be called upon to direct traffic, but I'm not aware of any special training to work extra employment doing traffic.
Okay. And besides for working in a nightclub setting or for possibly traffic, is there any other type of training that is afforded officers that express a desire to work in an extra job as a security officer?
I cannot think of any other training.
Okay. And there's no direct oversight other than looking at the hours that an officer might put in at an off-duty assignment. There's no oversight provisions at all. There's no requirement of that. Isn't that true?
No, that's not true. Pardon me. If you have a certain number of officers at a job, then a sergeant must be present.
Okay.
If there's more officers, there's another threshold to where a lieutenant has to be present. If you get to the size of a job like working a Houston Texans game, an assistant chief has to be in charge of the job.
Okay. But if it's less than 4 officers, there's no requirement for any of that. Isn't that true?
I guess it depends on what you mean as oversight.
What I mean is any type of oversight other than just checking the hours that they've worked. If there is other oversight, you can share that with me, but I don't hear that from you yet. Is that true?
Well, sure. If there's even 2 officers on the job, there's oversight from another officer as
From
far
one
as...
another? Mm-hmm.
And obviously the public, if the officer is working a job that's out in the public, let's say club job, there's a certain amount of oversight in the sense that the public can always complain about the officer's conduct or otherwise bring up an issue about an officer's conduct on a job.
Okay. As far as the Internal Affairs Investigation Department, has their investigation policy changed in the last 5 years?
May I go back to the oversight question real quick?
No, your attorney can help you with that. But as
I'd
far
just like to fully answer your question about oversight on extra employment.
Yeah, I understand, but I have another question that's on the table right now. I want to know about the Internal Affairs Department investigation policies. I want to know, have they changed at all within the last 5 years?
The practices have changed. As far as policy, I don't know if the policy itself has changed.
And when you say the practices have changed, how do they change?
Well, I think we had spoken about this earlier, that there are certain cases now where an officer may be verbally interrogated as opposed to given a written statement.
And are those recorded on audio or video, the current?
It's at least audio. I don't know if they're video recording.
Okay. And I'm sorry to interrupt. So you stated that the changes may have just been in the procedure, as where it would be possibly taking a verbal statement. Is that right?
That's correct.
Is there anything else?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. And this change, did that change with the new chief, or was that, what was the benchmark that change came in?
That came changed with the new chief, correct.
Okay. And so leading up to the new chief coming in, the policy had been pretty much the same for the 5-year period preceding this additional change, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And so a person who has been through the investigation before would be familiar with the investigation, correct? An internal affairs investigation.
They would be familiar with the process. That is correct.
Okay. And so in this instance, Harris, he had already been through 3 investigations, correct? Including this one.
I don't know how many he'd been through.
Okay. You are aware that he was investigated for killing a person in Fort Bend?
Yes.
Okay. And there was an investigation for that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And there was also a time where he was, in that time, the investigation, there was also a grand jury indictment in that based on that conduct by Officer Harris back then. You're aware of that, right?
It was my understanding the grand jury no-billed him.
No, he actually was indicted and went to trial. And that was, I want to say in 2011, and the incident happened in 2009.
That's right. I apologize. Yes.
Okay.
I do remember now it had gone to trial.
Yes, and he actually was acquitted at trial.
Yes.
Okay. And are you aware that, are you aware of the internal affairs investigation that he was involved in for a DWI incident, where
Yes.
he was also arrested and charged in that?
Yes.
Okay. So those are the instances that I was asking whether he had went through the internal affairs investigation as a result of those instances of conduct that was investigated. So you're aware of that, those investigations, correct?
I am.
Okay. And also Mahood has also been through investigations before as it relates to an in-custody death, I believe it was, where a person committed suicide when he was around. Are you aware of that?
I am not.
Okay. And would you agree that a person who is trained in something once and then trained again would be considered to have better training after the second time?
May I object? Vague and ambiguous, incomplete, hypothetical.
It's very difficult to answer your question because it's vague.
Okay. What's vague about it for you?
Well, it depends on what kind of training we're talking about, how long it was between the first training and the second training, and how that might be applied to a specific incident.
Okay. What discipline is is required, if any, when an officer has been determined to be untruthful in their statements?
So an untruthfulness can be up to and including indefinite suspension. I believe it starts at a category C, which is a 3 to 9 day suspension. But I'd have to consult the discipline matrix to make sure.
And for a 3 to 9 day suspension, that goes to the disciplinary board, correct? It's not something that their immediate supervisor could discipline them with. Isn't that true?
That is correct. It goes to the Administrative Disciplinary Committee.
Okay. And in this case, the Internal Affairs Department of the Police Department, they never questioned any conflicting accounts in Harris's and Mahud's report. Isn't that true?
I would not agree with that.
Okay. So there was questioning as it relates to some of the conflicting events in the report?
I'm not aware of conflicting accounts.
Okay, I'm sorry, I just presumed that. Thank you. So you don't believe that there was any conflicting accounts between Mahud's accounts of what occurred in reporting and Harris's accounts of what occurred in his reporting. Is that right?
No, typically you can have officers or witnesses on a scene that they have a perception of how a scene took place, and there may be some perceived incongruence with another person's statement.
Do you drug test officers in Harris County? I mean, excuse me, in the Houston Police Department?
Yes.
Okay. How often? Is it random?
That is one form of drug testing that we do.
Okay. How often are officers drug test?
There's a computer program that's used, so there's not a specific schedule, otherwise it would take away from the randomness.
Okay.
But random drug testing does occur, and each station has a coordinator, and they're told each month if there's someone at the division that is required for random drug testing.
Okay. And what drugs are looked for in the test?
Metabolites that have to do with cocaine. They look for THC, which is the ingredient in marijuana.
Okay.
And there's one more, but I don't recall what it is.
Okay. So not for steroids or anything like that?
The third one may be steroids, a metabolite from steroids.
Okay. And so there's no way if you wanted to test them, say for today, just say, you know, not you, but supervisor or whatever department's responsible for that, they couldn't just pluck out officers and say, hey, I want to test you and you. It's based on the computer system, is that right?
We have for-cause testing, and
Okay.
so if a supervisor has some reasonable suspicion that employee is on drugs, or if they're observed to be acting erratically, they can be referred for a for-cause drug test.
Okay. And as far as this term that we've been using, coordinator, can you tell me exactly what a coordinator is?
Sure, it's a supervisor in each unit that has, when I say an additional responsibility, it's something they do on top of other responsibilities that they already have within their assignment, to also be the drug testing coordinator for their unit, for their division. And that coordinator is the person that receives notification from our drug testing unit as to the employees within that unit or division who have to be tested for that month.
Okay. And what about the coordinator in the context of, in this case, Mike Prowsey?
What about Mike Browsey?
He's been, excuse me, his title has been described as coordinator. Can you tell me about what that means for Mr. Prowsey to be a coordinator?
I may be confusing terms a little bit because I believe the actual coordinator is the person within HPD who has ultimate responsibility for the drug testing program.
Okay.
And that person works in consult with the City of Houston. The people at the division and unit level, I cannot remember what their actual title is, but they are the division or unit liaison for drug testing.
Okay. And what about for extra jobs? The coordinator for extra jobs, who is that person?
Well, the extra employment unit is going to have supervisors in it. I think they fall under a lieutenant who reports to a captain within the inspections division.
Okay. Now, Mike Prowsey is supposed to be a coordinator for extra jobs. Is that your understanding?
I don't know who Mike Prowsey, I know the name. I don't know what responsibilities he has.
So he doesn't have the title of coordinator through the Houston Police Department, is that right? For extra jobs?
No, that's, when you're talking about extra employment, the term coordinator is not something, I'm sorry, let me think about this. Actually, by policy, yes, there is a defined term for coordinator. And so if he is listed, if Mike Prowsey is listed as the coordinator for extra employment on his permit and that was approved, then he is recognized by the department as the coordinator for that extra employment.
Okay. And what I'm asking you is there an actual title given to him by the City of Houston through its police department? And when I say him, Mike Prowsey, as a coordinator, an extra job coordinator.
A title, it's something that describes his function for that extra job. If the permit says he's the extra job coordinator, then I guess you could use the term title, but it's more of a description of his function. He coordinates the extra job. He may not necessarily be one of the officers, on the ground working the job.
And does the City of Houston give him the authority to coordinate the jobs?
The authority to coordinate the job would actually come from the extra employer who's
Okay.
hiring that officer as the coordinator.
So that title might come from the extra job employer, not the City of Houston, is that right?
No, the title is by policy. It's a defined term within 300-14, our general order on extra employment.
Okay.
But that the authority to coordinate, which means to schedule other officers, would ultimately come from the extra employer.
Okay. And not from the City of Houston, correct?
I mean, it's probably a dual recognition there, because if the city is approving his extra employment permit as coordinator, the city is also saying, yes, you can schedule officers for this job.
Perfect, thank you. Okay. And if a officer is determined that has engaged in conduct that he essentially or she essentially should not have, is there any hesitation in disciplining these officers if they have engaged in conduct that is prohibited by the department?
May I object? Vague and ambiguous, incomplete, hypothetical.
I mean, the department always fully considers the facts and circumstances of each case. And if it's a case that goes to the level of the chief is going to consider whether discipline is appropriate. And then there's some cases that only go, or at least the captain, sorry, now called commander, makes the final decision in discipline.
Okay. So, in this case, Officer Mike Prowsey, how would he be granted a permit for a coordinator? What are the requirements to be a coordinator?
He would have to file a permit through the extra employment system, naming himself as coordinator, and then that would be reviewed by the extra employment office, and I'm sorry, it would first be reviewed by his direct supervisor, and then it would go to the extra employment office.
Okay. Does every extra job have a coordinator?
No.
Okay. Why would a job require a coordinator?
If there are a number of officers working there and the extra employer desires basically one point of contact in order to schedule the officers,
Okay.
that person would be a coordinator.
And so Mike Prowsey's contract as a coordinator, that would be considered a personal business, right?
I'm not aware of a contract.
No, I apologize. Permit. That would be a permit to allow him to conduct personal business. It wouldn't be considered police business, correct?
He's basically working as sort of like a contractor for the extra employer, but still subject to the rules and policies of the Houston Police Department.
Okay. Now, these coordinators are not allowed to coordinate like while they're on duty, right?
No.
Okay. And what provisions are in place to make sure that doesn't happen? Because it seems like it could happen.
Well, 300-14 is our general order on extra employment, and I think if a person were found to be doing that, that would probably implicate another couple of general orders. But officers are trained that they cannot, what we call double dip. You cannot engage in extra employment while you're on duty with the city.
Okay. And his supervisor would monitor his hours because he has to log those hours in, correct? That he is working as an extra job officer, I guess, in coordinating, correct?
In 2015, the supervisor would be looking at the weekly classified time entry system.
Okay. And we were talking earlier about Harris and his being indicted and having to go to trial for homicide. I think it was negligent homicide, if I remember correctly, in Fort Bend County. He was placed on administrative leave at that time, correct?
He was placed on what's called relieved of duty administrative.
It's called relieved of duty, I'm sorry?
I'm sorry, it's called relieved of duty. I believe he was placed at home status.
It's called at-home status?
Well, there's two kinds of relieved of duty.
Okay.
At home, where the officer has to remain at their place of residence during business hours.
Okay.
They have to be available to the Internal Affairs Division. And then there's relieved of duty admin, which is the officer is removed from a position where they they can come into contact with the public, and they're put into a working position where the city can still utilize them in a working fashion.
Okay.
They're just not doing police work.
All right. And Harris was placed in the at-home study or status?
I believe he was.
Okay. I think that he mentioned that he had admin leave. Is that right? Does that sound like?
It's quite possible he was placed on related duty admin. I don't remember which one it was.
Okay. How does the department or the city of Houston determine which officers should be placed on admin leave or, as you stated, home status?
Ultimately, that demarcation is set by the chief, and so it may change depending on who the chief is.
Okay. And he was on, as I stated, the homicide took place in 2009, and he was not acquitted until 2011. So he was on admin leave for 2 years, and this was paid. What type of status would you determine that would be?
Well, it could have been related duty at home or related duty administrative.
Okay. Both ways they're paid, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. And how does the department determine what officers are, well, why was he paid to stay home for 2 years pending the outcome of this criminal investigation or criminal trial? Because he was already indicted.
Sure. So it goes back to the due process that is afforded to officers from Chapter 143 of the Texas Local Government Code. And that is that the department may delay the administrative investigation during the pendency of a criminal investigation, basically to see how the criminal investigation and potential trial plays out before an administrative decision is made on the internal affairs case.
Okay. But one could have been made prior to the outcome of the criminal trial, correct? Based on the indictment?
It could have.
Okay. Do you know the reason why he was not relieved of duty indefinitely after he was indicted for the homicide?
Why he was not indefinitely suspended?
Yes.
I do not.
Okay. And this was after he had already been suspended for his DWI, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Are there any requirements to be a coordinator?
For extra employment?
For extra employment, I'm sorry, yes.
I mean, other than having a club card, if you're going to coordinate club jobs, I don't know of any other special requirements.
Okay. And there's no special permits other than, like you said, a club card if you're going to work night clubs, correct?
Correct.
So there's nothing in place to ensure like there's equality or no discrimination in coordinating extra jobs, is that right?
No, I don't think that's a fair statement because any police officer, whether they're working extra employment or not, is still subject to the rules and procedures of the Houston Police Department. And so if an officer feels as if they've been discriminated against, even in an extra employment context, they can bring that issue to the Houston Police Department.
Okay. In the the Police Department, how would they handle an issue like that if a person says that, for example, Mike Prowsley never gives any minorities any extra jobs that he has the ability to under, the extra jobs he has available to coordinate? How would the department handle that?
Well, a complaint like that would most likely come into the Alternative Dispute Resolution Unit,
Okay.
and then depending on the allegations, either it could be handled in the Alternative Dispute Resolution Unit, or it may be referred to the Internal Affairs Division.
Okay. And an officer, whenever they're working an extra job, they have to submit work cards, correct?
It's possible the extra employer may require them to submit some type of work card.
Okay. Are the work cards ever audited by the police department at all? Is there an audit system in place?
Yes, there is.
Okay. Do you know how often they're audited?
I do not.
Okay. Do you know what they're audited for?
Yes, we have had audits in the past where the inspections division will approach the extra employers and ask for time records, payroll records, to ensure that what the officers are reporting as far as extra employment matches up with the payroll records.
Okay. And do you know if that ever occurred with La Estancia?
I don't know.
Okay. And both of these officers needed a permit in order to work at La Estancia, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And they couldn't use the coordinator's permit, isn't that true?
That's correct. They need their own permit.
Okay. Do you know who Mike Prowsey's supervisor was when this incident occurred?
No, ma'am.
Okay. I know you mentioned you really didn't even know him, so I knew that was a long shot. Is it commonplace for a coordinator to work from the same station as the officers that they tend to, I guess, place as in extra jobs, or is it something that they can reach out to different departments throughout the police department community?
It can work both ways. I mean, naturally, a coordinator may reach out to people they know, and that may be the officers they work with at the division. But oftentimes, coordinators can reach out to officers in other divisions.
So how do they do that? Say, for example, I'm a coordinator and I'm working at Southeast Division, and I want to get some officers to do an extra job assignment with, for me. I want to coordinate this. How do I get in touch with these officers if not while I'm on duty?
Well, many officers contact each other off duty, and so it could be something as simple as a text or a phone call to see if they want to work a job.
Okay. And was there a pre-disciplinary hearing conducted in this case that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of whether there was one or not.
Okay. And do you know whether Harris, in the previous case, the homicide case, whether he signed an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a suspension agreement?
I do not believe he was suspended in that case.
I'm sorry, the relief of duty. I call that a suspension. I guess it's not a suspension. The relief of duty.
Relieved of duty practice would have been that the officer would have been served with a relieved of duty letter that outlines the requirements of their relieved of duty status.
Okay. All right. And just a moment. Was there any type of training for Officer Harris relating to the use of force after he was acquitted of the homicide back in 2011?
I would have to look at his training record to see if he received any use of force training after that.
But if his training record did not reflect that, you would say that he didn't receive any additional use of force training?
If he received training, it should be in his training record.
Okay. And just one moment. Can we take a quick break so I can grab his training record?
We're off the record. The time is 2:05. We're back on the record. The time is 2:12 p.m.
Okay. Lieutenant Moreland, can you tell me whether Harris was retrained after he returned to work from his criminal trial?
I do not know, and that would all be dependent on if there were even sustained citations of misconduct in the case.
Okay. And what do you mean by sustained misconduct in the case? Did you mean the criminal case, or what do you mean?
No, in the internal affairs investigation.
Okay. And there was a sustained complaint in the internal affairs investigation. Give me just a moment. So if there was a sustained complaint, he should have been retrained, is what you're stating?
No, not necessarily.
Okay.
It all depends on what the citation of misconduct is,
Mm-hmm.
the facts and circumstances surrounding that citation of misconduct. And so it's definitely not the case that a citation of misconduct would necessarily necessitate remedial training.
Okay. And so only in the event that an officer has sustained internal affairs investigation discipline will the department consider retraining an officer for use of force. Is that what you're stating?
No.
Okay.
There can also be retraining at any time, and of course we have mandatory training on use of force, and so officers are going to get that training whether or not they've been subject to an internal affairs investigation.
How often is that training, and when does that training occur, I should say?
Well, we just had it in the last training cycle, and so I do not know when we'll have it again, maybe a couple years, I don't know for sure.
Okay. And how often, you said, so you didn't know how often the training occurs? Just
I do not.
Okay. But you don't know of any specific training for use of force that's outside of the mandatory that all the officers get, that an officer who's been on trial for use of force, criminal trial, would get upon returning to work. Is that right?
I'm sorry, say that question again?
Can you repeat the question, please? I'm sorry.
But you don't know of any specific training for use of force as outside of the mandatory that all of the officers get, that an officer has been on a trial for use of force, criminal trial, would get upon returning to work. Is that right?
May object, compound and confusing.
I mean, it could happen, but it doesn't necessarily have to happen.
Okay. So there's no policy in place to say, hey, this person has just been in a criminal trial for use of force and who's been investigation and been on leave for 2 years. As a result, this person, there's nothing in place to say this person needs to be retrained specifically in use of force. Is that right?
No, that's very fact specific, and so policy generally doesn't get that specific
Okay.
with situations.
What about generally? For an officer that's been disciplined and has been off the force on or not suspension, on administrative leave for an extended period of time as a result of use of force?
Again, it would depend upon the facts and circumstances surrounding that incident, what the citations of misconduct were in the internal affairs investigation, and the final decision of the chief.
Okay. So there are mandatory suspension that's available under those circumstances when a person has been on administrative leave after the use of force. There has been training required by that individual before returning to work or when they return to work?
May object, confusing.
Can you ask that again?
Sure. There are instances where an officer who has been off duty on administrative leave after the use of force, who has been required to retrain before returning or upon returning to work. Is that right?
There could be. I don't know of any specific case off the top of my head.
Okay. I'm going to give you what I'm going to mark as exhibit number 2. I have copies today. Oh, sorry about that. You were closer.
Thank you.
And that's Officer Harris's discipline record. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
This is not a discipline record.
What is that?
This is what we call the 3x5, which is a list of the allegations that have been looked at by the Internal Affairs Division
Okay.
and the disposition of each of those citations.
Okay, so it's his complaint history, basically what the title says, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And he has a few there, isn't that right?
There's a few, yes.
Okay. And was there any additional training after the sustained complaints?
Well, I'd have to look at his training record to know
Okay.
whether there was any training. I mean, each officer goes through training every year, so yes, absolutely, he
Okay.
received training.
But is there specific training after a person is found, or a complaint is found to be sustained?
It's on a case-by-case basis whether an officer is sent for remedial or follow-up training after an internal affairs investigation.
What about for a at-fault car accident?
Yes. Typically, officers go to training after a crash.
Okay. What about for sexual harassment? Is there any?
You're saying if an officer is found to
Yes.
have engaged in sexual harassment?
Yes.
Well, if they're not fired, then yes, they would be sent to training.
Okay. So normally, if an officer is engaged in, or found, sorry, sustained, that officer has engaged in sexual harassment, it's common that they are terminated?
I don't know whether it's common or not. I know of some cases where the employee was either terminated or they retired during the pendency of the investigation.
Okay. Okay. Should Harris have been retrained for use of force if he wasn't trained for use of force after he returned to work?
On which case?
On the homicide case, when he returned to work from the killing of Sylvanus Lombe. I'm sorry, I'll spell that for you later.
Well, ultimately, that decision is made by the chief of police.
Okay.
And
Okay. You said that there is a mandatory use of force or training by the officers that's required by the officers, I should say. It's required.
we had a mandatory training within the last 2 years that was entitled Response to Resistance,
Okay.
and all officers were required to go through the training.
Okay. And what about, is there a training for how to prevent the use of excessive force?
That is part of all use of force
Okay.
training.
Okay. What would be the consequences of requiring mandatory training after an officer has had a complaint that has been sustained surrounding the use of force?
I'm sorry, say that again?
What would be the consequence of providing additional training to an officer who has had a complaint for use of force or an event conduct surrounding the use of force that has been sustained?
May object, vague and ambiguous, incomplete, hypothetical.
Well, the consequence of a sustained use of force complaint is the chief has the prerogative to send that person for additional training.
Okay. And are there any handbooks or manuals relating to use of force in the Houston Police Department that are made available to the officers?
Sure, we have a policy on use of force,
Okay.
and then we have training materials utilized in the classroom setting.
Okay. Thank you. And is there a difference in investigating an officer who has been accused of or has used deadly force in investigating that officer versus a person in the general public who has used deadly force, a civilian,
And you said, is there a difference?
in investigating?
I would say there's even a heightened scrutiny when an officer has used force, because you're going to have an administrative investigation as well as the criminal investigation. That certainly does not occur when a member of the public uses deadly force.
Okay. And what is tell me some differences on the heightened scrutiny.
Sure. Well, the Internal Affairs Division is going to complete an investigation from an administrative context, which can certainly look at different areas than what the criminal investigation may look at. It's looking at those same acts, but also looking at whether there are violations of department policy. So you basically you have another set of eyes that is reviewing the officer's conduct to see if everything was done properly.
Okay. Is there anything else that would distinguish an officer's heightened scrutiny investigation versus a regular citizen's investigation by homicide?
I think the fact that we have several levels of review within the Houston Police Department, the IPOB, the Independent Police Oversight Board, the Administrative Disciplinary Committee that will review officer-involved shootings, and the fact that the chief will review an officer-involved shooting. And so that is definitely part of the heightened level of scrutiny.
Okay. Who is the person that actually communicates with the chief about the investigations that have taken place leading up to the chief of police actually making a determination?
So it could be his lawyers. It could be members of the Internal Affairs Division Command. And so, yeah, those people.
Okay. But the Citizen Review Board, they're not able to actually directly interact with the chief of police regarding their recommendations, correct?
Well, it's not that they're prevented from it. It's just they have a setting to where they can come and review the case in a private setting, so that the confidentiality of the case may be maintained, and they can privately do it without any interruptions. There's nothing to say that that person cannot request an audience with the chief.
Okay. And why are these settings private?
Well, by law, there's confidentiality in the internal affairs investigation.
Okay.
And so in order to uphold the law, that review is going to take place in a private a private setting.
But doesn't the Citizen Review Board convene after the investigation is completed with the Internal Affairs Department?
They do.
So there's no longer that need for confidentiality through the IA because it's completed. So why would the Citizen Board need to be also?
No, the confidentiality is still attached and remains at that point.
Okay. All right. Moving on, can we agree that had Mr. Flores not had a weapon in his hand at the time that he was shot in his back, that the use of force would have been considered unreasonable by the department?
No,
May I object? Incomplete hypothetical.
no, I can't agree to that.
Okay. And tell us why.
Well, I don't know the officer's statements. If Mr. Flores didn't have a gun, then what was the officer's perception? What did the officer see? What did the officer reasonably perceive?
Why don't you have the officer's statements? Have you not been provided their statements?
Oh, no, I have their statements.
Okay. I'm sorry, I thought you said you didn't have their statements.
No, I have their statements, but you were changing the parameters of the scene, so I thought that that could necessarily change the officer's statement.
Okay. And just simply, their statement currently is that the reason why he was shot was because he had a gun in his hand.
May I object? This states the evidence.
I apologize. You're right. I'm sorry. Not only that he had a gun in his hand, that he pointed the gun at Officer Harris.
Yes, that's what it states.
Right. So he did not have that gun in his hand, and he was still shot. Would you say that the use of force, under the circumstances that we have them, would mean that the use of force was unreasonable?
May I object? Incomplete hypothetical.
No, I wouldn't say that because that's what the officer perceived. He perceived that there was a gun being pointed at him.
Right, but I'm asking if there was no gun pointing at him. We take that factor out. Would you consider that shot in his back to be considered an unreasonable use of force?
May I object? Incomplete hypothetical.
Again, taking the officer's statement as they are and not changing them. That's what he perceived.
Right, but I'm not asking you to take them as they are and not change them. I'm saying take the gun out of the equation. If you take the gun out of the equation, do you still have the same position?
May I object? Incomplete hypothetical.
Then that goes back to my original answer that I don't know what the officer's statements
Okay.
are.
That's fair enough. I just want to know what your position is on that. I'm not trying to trick you or anything. Now, you indicated that the officers are trained for use of force and kind of what it means for excessive force. Are they trained specifically on what type of force is inappropriate? Are they provided with any type of training as it relates to examples or anything that would constitute improper force?
Sure, examples are provided, case law is provided, but obviously in training you have to train the parameters, you have to train officers to think. You can provide some examples, but you can never cover every single situation that an officer may be placed in.
Okay. But there is some sort of training on what is inappropriate conduct as far as it relates to use of force, correct?
Yes.
Okay. What type of mechanism do you have in place that would allow a person who wanted to hire an off-duty officer to gain information on the officer's personnel history?
Any member of the public can file a records request to get the officer's complaint history, and so that would be a mechanism they can utilize.
Through the PIA?
Yes.
Okay. And can they interview or request information from the officer directly?
They can. That's up to that extra employer. The city's not going to regulate that transaction between the officer and the extra employer.
Okay. And is the city aware, you guys are clearly aware of the homicide involving Sylvanus Okhueleigbbe by Officer Harris, correct? We kind of discussed that, right?
Yes.
Okay. And would you say that after that occurred, that it was more unlikely that Officer Harris would use deadly force again? Is it more unlikely?
May I object? Confusing calls for speculation.
I have no idea whether it makes him more unlikely to use deadly force.
There's probably no way to gauge that, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And do you know whether the city provided Officer Harris any assistance with the criminal trial at all, as it relates to legal assistance?
No, from my understanding, that was his counsel were HPOU attorneys, and I don't know if the union paid for that or if he paid for that.
Okay, but the city definitely did not pay for any of those, his legal proceedings, correct?
No.
Okay. All right, and that would be Aaron Suter?
Yes.
Okay. Does the city engage with Aaron Suter on any type of contractual level?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. He doesn't work for the city at all?
No.
Okay. Are officers required to wear their uniforms while they're performing off-duty jobs?
When they file their permit, they have to declare whether it's going to be a uniform job or a plainclothes job. So if they have declared it as a uniform job, then yes, they must have their uniform on.
Okay. But what if they declare it as a plainclothes job? What does that mean?
So there might be certain security jobs where the extra employer wants the police officer to be in a suit or business casual or something to that effect. And so the officer may apply to work the job as a plainclothes officer.
Okay. And in the event an officer were to request to work a job as a plainclothes officer, is he prohibited from showing up to that job with a uniform?
Not by the city, he's not.
Okay. And what about if an officer indicates that they would be wearing their uniform? Are they prohibited from showing up in plain clothes?
Well, they certainly cannot work the extra employment in plain clothes if it is a uniform, if they've applied for a uniform job.
Okay. And what does a uniform mean? What does it mean for an officer to actually be in uniform?
So an officer has to wear a duty uniform. If they're a bicycle officer, they may wear a bicycle uniform. If they're a patrol officer, they're going to wear just the normal everyday uniform that they would wear on patrol.
Okay. And so they have to wear their actual uniform that they would have worn if they were clocking in to duty, correct?
There are some specifics in the policy, and I cannot recall the exact wording, but they have to be in an official department uniform.
Okay. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be the type of uniform that they work in every day, correct?
I would have to consult the policy to make sure.
Okay. I think I'm almost ready to pass the witness here. Just a minute. So, whether the officer on the extra duty job wears plain clothes or uniform, that's up to the person hiring them, correct?
Yes.
And you stated before that the chief makes the decisions on the discipline that an officer might face after the use of force. Does the chief have the? Is that the person who determines whether the officer will be paid or unpaid during a leave, if that's required?
So, if you're speaking of if you're speaking of the relieved of duty status?
Yes, yes.
That is always a paid status.
Okay. Is there a version of that that's unpaid?
I believe there may be a provision in the law, but I am not familiar enough with it.
Okay. So when a person is placed on administrative leave and it's paid, is there anything required from the officer since they are being paid as it relates to work or anything like that?
So if they are relieved of duty administrative, they will report to a work location where they typically do not have contact with the public. They're certainly not taking police action. So they may be sent to supply, to issue uniforms or something like that.
Are they able to work extra jobs during that period?
No, they're not.
Okay. All right. Let's see. All right, and before I pass the witness, you understand that you were asked to be here today as a representative of the City of Houston, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and based on the deposition notice that you have there are topics there that you were prepared to testify with today, correct?
Yes.
Okay, and you understand that the City of Houston is going to be strictly liable for your accounting of the knowledge that you have in answering your questions today. You understand that, correct?
May I object? Calls for a legal conclusion.
To the lawyer, right? No, I told you to take your hat off the other day, so we'll keep it that way. And but you are the person most knowledgeable with the issues outlined in this notice, correct?
That is called here to testify, yes.
Okay. I pass the witness.
All right, Lieutenant, my name is Kimberly Clark, and as you heard earlier, I represent Los Morefield Apartments and 2012 Multifamily Real Estate Fund. Do you understand that?
Yes.
Okay. It's my understanding, and please correct me if I am incorrect, but do you have familiarity with the internal affairs investigation involved regarding this case with Officer Harris and Officer Morefield?
I do.
Okay. Earlier you gave us the steps for an internal affairs investigation. And what I'm asking you simply at this time is whether or not those same steps that you testified to earlier were followed in the internal affairs investigation of Officer Harris as it relates to this incident.
From what I could tell, my review of the case, yes.
Okay. Were those steps also followed in the internal affairs investigation of Officer Morefield as it relates to this investigation?
Objection leading. You can answer.
Again, from my review of this case, yes.
Do you know what the ultimate determination was in the internal affairs investigation regarding Officer Harris?
In this particular case?
In this particular case.
Yes.
Okay. And what was that ultimate determination or finding?
I believe that the shooting was justified, and that now I can't remember whether there was another sustained citation of misconduct or not.
Okay. With respect to Officer Mahood, do you know what the ultimate determination was in the internal affairs investigation?
On him, I don't recall whether there was another sustained citation of misconduct that was cited or not.
Okay. Was it determined to be a justified shooting or unjustified?
I don't think Officer Mahood.
Well, that's right. He didn't actually shoot.
Correct.
Okay. So the question there is whether or not he received a sustained citation. Was that your testimony?
Well, he would not have received a citation one way or the other for a shooting.
Okay.
Because he did not shoot.
Okay, and as far as the ultimate determination of the investigation, what was your testimony regarding that question?
Now I can't remember whether there was a sustained citation of misconduct in that case.
Okay. You testified earlier about IPOB. Could you tell me what that stands for again?
Independent Police Oversight Board.
Okay. And what does that board do?
They review internal affairs investigations of police shootings, of serious bodily injury, in custody deaths, those types of serious cases.
Okay, so after a police shooting, you have an internal affairs investigation, and then IPOB does another investigation of the investigation that IA did?
I wouldn't characterize what they do as an investigation.
Okay.
They review the internal affairs investigation that is provided to them.
And when they review that finding, are they making a determination of whether or not the IA investigation was complete and or sufficient?
Yes.
Okay. In this particular case, with respect to Officer Harris, did IPOB find that the investigation was complete and sufficient and or sufficient?
I have not reviewed the IPOB sheet for this particular case, so I do not know.
Okay. So would that be also be your answer for Officer Mahood
Yes.
as well? Okay.
Yes.
Now, with respect to the notice that you had today, did the internal affairs investigation find that Officer Harris's conduct on the date of this incident was in accordance with the HPD arrest and detainment procedure policy?
I'm sorry, I'd have to review the investigative summary again to see what the final outcome was.
Okay. Would that also be for, if I ask you the same question for Officer Mahood, would that also be your response?
Yes.
Okay. With respect to Officer Harris's conduct being in accordance with HPD's use of force policy, do you know what the determination was in that respect?
The determination was justified shooting.
Okay. And as far as HPD, the HPD general order on extra employment, was Officer Harris's conduct or behavior found to be in accordance with that policy?
Objection leading.
Again, I would have to review the investigation summary to see what was determined as far as the extra employment policy.
And if I ask you that same question for Officer Mahood, would that also be your response?
Yes.
With respect to Officer Harris's conduct in providing medical care, was it determined whether or not his behavior on the date of the incident was in accordance with the HPD policy on medical care training?
I don't recall there being an allegation of misconduct in regard to medical care.
Okay. And if I asked you the same question with respect to Officer Mahood, would that also be your response?
Yes.
Was Officer Harris disciplined for his use of force in this incident?
He was not.
We'll pass the witness.
Mr. Brett?
Let me take a break.
Well, the record, the time is 2:48.